is that Beijing has allowed Apple to exploit its workers so that China can in turn exploit Apple. Hi, this is Anita, the Global Trade Gal. Today I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. I'm going to actually talk about a book or give a bit of a book review. And the book is a book entitled Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. Anyone who's worked in Asia understands what a great impact China has had on Apple. And this really is, I believe, a very interesting book that goes through the entire history of Apple. It talks about Apple products. If you're an Apple fan like I am, I use a lot of Apple products. But not only that, if you're interested in China and China trade and a lot of the things that are happening today and why they're happening today, this really is a great book to be able to read to understand some of those things. I'm going to quote now from the book, and this is at the beginning of the book, and I think it's one of the most important parts of it. It says, the prevailing Western narrative about Apple in China is remarkably narrow. The go-to story of the past 2 decades has been about the tedium of assembling Apple products, a tale of low wages, underage employees, 16-hour workdays, suicides at Foxconn, and acquisitions of Uyghur labor. Yeah, that's really true. You talk to a lot of people in the Western world, and particularly the United States, a lot of them have this view about Apple, Foxconn, low labor, about all these, long working hours, and that's why they're able to produce the Apple phone. It's a lot of what you're seeing today happening with a lot of these tariffs and things that are going on. It has to do with this perspective that people have about this. But, and then he says, this narrative isn't wrong, but it misses the bigger piece of the puzzle. And here I think is one of the most important parts of the entire puzzle with the relationship between Apple and China. It's not merely that Apple has exploited Chinese workers. It's that Beijing has allowed Apple to exploit its workers so that China can in turn exploit Apple. Now, I don't know if many of you know, some of you out there might know or may not know, I may have mentioned this before, but from 1980 to 1985, my uncle, my father's oldest brother, was the United States ambassador to China. I actually come from a family which is quite you'd say, China was probably our more or less our family business. My grandfather became a missionary in China for the Methodist Church. And he later, when he came home, before my father was actually born, he came back to the United States and became head of the Asian Department of the Library of Congress. So he spent most of his career in the Library of Congress as one of their top scholars who bought a lot of the collections of the maps and books and set up a lot of the Asian study programs throughout the United States. Fast forward years later, my uncle, who was actually born in China, and Chinese was his more or less native language, and he left China when he was about 8 years old, went back to China during college and ended up in a concentration camp there during World War II, and then ended up fighting with the Kuomintang, which would have been the Taiwan government, which the Kuomintang later fled to Taiwan. So, but he was, with the Kuomintang and the Chinese communists together fighting against the Japanese during World War II. I remember going to visit him in Beijing, and we were sitting down just at a normal, so I think it probably was a breakfast or something like that. The night before, I had been to a, meeting that they had in the embassy where a lot of American businesses were coming in and they were, talking about things they wanted to get from China, have China produce and other things like that. And I remember him turning to me and saying, they just don't listen to me. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I keep telling them one day they're going to be sorry. One day they're going to be sorry because China is going to become their biggest competitor. So fast forward now, we're in 2025, and this is exactly what's been happening. And that's really, the whole crux of this book that he talks about here is based upon a lot of that of what my own, uncle had told me so many years ago. That, that it's not merely that Apple has exploited Chinese workers, it's that Beijing has allowed Apple to exploit its workers so China can in turn exploit Apple. So you think about that statement, and I believe that's very powerful on a lot of things that's going on today. In fact, it's been said, as he said in this book and as the author has said, is that a lot of China's technology and technological advances today came because Apple went in and taught them. I remember I had a friend that worked for Apple's product department, and he told me that coming out of San Francisco and many other major cities, the United Business class every day flying into Asia was at least half of Apple's employees. And he said, many times I'd be on the plane and I'd see people that I knew. And all of that was going on until, suddenly COVID came in, of course, and changed all this. We had this huge shift going on because of COVID. So this really, I believe, is a profound book, and I recommend. It's a book by Patrick McGee, and it's really well documented. It's a book that really tells the story of Apple, tells the story of Foxconn, tells the story of Apple's importance in China and how Apple started in China and the reasons why they started in China, and really how China built Apple and Apple built China. And I think that that's important to understand, that this was a relationship where they were both getting something out of it. And it was an important relationship. And a lot of the person that was really driving this was really Tim Cook, who's now the CEO of Apple. So if you're interested in the book, you will go through the early days of Apple's entry into China, and he paints the pictures of Apple going into China, how they got into China, why they went into China, and how really I had to it cracked me up reading about Foxconn's factory with the tin roofs and the rain pouring down, and they could hardly hear each other speak because the owners of Foxconn were so cheap that they weren't going to put air conditioning or put proper things in, unless they absolutely needed it. And, talks about all of that how, the workers could barely, hear themselves over the rumbling of the huge rainstorms. It talks about, Foxconn's transformation in China, and, how, Foxconn, how they basically, started transforming, becoming more and more important to China. It talks about, Tim Cook's leadership and his, Apple's strategy of the background in supply chain management that made him, very important. It talked about how, a lot of how Apple negotiated with a lot of the suppliers, which actually was a really tough negotiation. Some people might have a harder time with that, and how they really, really negotiated a lot of these suppliers down, and that, how thousands of engineers and workers in China were trained. That, literally Apple has trained more engineers than any other company. Literally millions and millions of Chinese engineers have been trained by Apple and by the American engineers through Apple. It's estimated that Apple's investment in China reached $55 billion per year by 2015. You think about that for a minute. What a huge amount of investment they were investing in China every year. $55 billion. That's an astronomical figure. It doesn't include the cost of components and Apple's hardware, the so-called bill of materials, which can more than double the figure. So really, Apple invested a huge amount in China and a huge amount in training, because they flew so many engineers, American engineers, over to China to be able to train these engineers. It goes back to my thinking of what my uncle told me so long ago in the 80s when he was really at the forefront of American companies coming into China. American companies in many ways rushed into China. They didn't make sure the laws were in place, the other things were in place. They went in there and they basically saw, here's a chance for me to have cheap labor and to make a profit. And that's what we did. And now, in a way, there might be some people that say we're paying the price for it. You can decide that for yourself. But I do recommend that you read this book, because it's very interesting between this relationship between China and Apple, which has not always been a good relationship. And it's actually made, Apple was made by China, but at the same time, there was a cost to that. And that's kind of what I got out of this entire book, that, Apple made China, maybe, China made Apple at the same time. But, there's probably been a cost on both sides for this relationship. And, because of that, like as it said, I believe I read this in this book where it said, an Apple phone has 1,000 pieces or something like that. I don't know if that's exactly correct. If someone out there works for Apple and knows the exact number, please don't quote me on this. But Apple's phone, of course, has a lot of pieces, and all those pieces need suppliers. And so when they talk about, bringing, phone production back to the United States, that's very difficult. Where are 1,000 factories going to, suddenly build up? Where are you going to get the workers? Where are you going to get the materials and all the other things? It's not so easy to move a supply chain as everyone thinks it is, or everyone seems to think it is. That's not in this industry. And I can tell you this really is very difficult to be able to move the supply chain. If you get a chance, check out this book. Again, it's called Apple in China. the capture of the world's largest company. You can also read my review on the book, which is, I've written a book. It's a book report, Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company by Patrick McGee. I will put a link below in that. And we've also done like a little video on it. So you can also, if you want to, you can just sort of watch the video that we did that sort of reviews the main book. But, I wrote in here, I said, a book that inspires and alarms. And I think that's really the key to it. That this is a book which, in many ways inspires me, but also alarms me. And that's why I feel like everyone should sort of read this book, especially if you're in the global supply chain. I believe that this is a book that you should read or listen to or get it on your Audible or however you decide to read or listen to books, because it is a very important book. This is Anita from the Global Trade Gal. Thank you so much for listening. We hope that you'll press that subscribe button. It does make a difference. It's amazing how many people listen and they don't subscribe. So we hope that you will become one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for being part of our community.